Porter Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank you to the last speaker. I want to add a little bit of clarity to your debate speech on this, but I want to start with actually acknowledging the work of the Minister, the work that the Minister has done on this bill, and actually that she was very open and encouraging for the Christchurch MPs to get involved in discussions early on when the bill was being put together, because we all have an expectation that our property boundaries will be resolved. And there was a very real danger that unless we could agree a way forward, that there might be some discussion and dissension and debate. So I want to acknowledge the fact that she got the parties into the room with the officials to talk through some of the key points about this bill. Because as a matter of background, as some of the previous speakers have said, what happened was that the earth and the property boundaries were impacted by things such as lateral spread. So when the earth actually stretches, potentially stretches your boundary, it also has the impact in some places where the earth lifted of shrinking boundaries. So in order to be fair to property owners, in order to be fair to the ratepayers of Christchurch, something had to go in place to ensure that boundaries could be, if they needed to be redrawn, but could be in an equitable way so that neighbours, you minimise whatever dispute you may have between boundary neighbours. This bill was put together in order for that to be accomplished. And as a very visual kind of representation of what happens, Mr. Speaker, in my electorate, where we have a large section of the Avon River flowing through the electorate, and a large part of the red zone is actually bound on either side of the Avon River. What happened was that one side of the river dropped and the other side of the river spread. So when you drive down places like New Brighton Road, for example, on one side of the road you're actually below the waterline of the river. And when so there are impacts upon you as a property owner. Now, large tracts of that land has been red zoned, so that is taken out of the equation. That is not covered by this bill. But immediately up against the red zone, of course, are the properties which are still zoned as being able to be habitable, because the land is actually still relatively okay. So it's those properties which are up against the red zone, or up against those areas of that land where it has significantly been impacted, that this bill will apply. Now, what I do want to clarify in the previous speaker's speech is the issue around interim surveys. So surveys were conducted, on normal properties prior to the earthquake. You have a survey. Then the earthquake happened, and then we have a period before this bill will be introduced. And the surveys that were conducted from the time after the earthquake sequence and before this bill will take effect is the interim period for the surveys. Now, those surveys will be quite different in many cases to surveys that were done prior to the earthquake sequence. So it's these surveys which may provide some contention and some dispute amongst neighbours, or so that is where the submitters actually made the major contribution in this bill, and the New Zealand Law Society provided quite a comprehensive submission on that, dealing with the issue of what an interim survey actually was, and then with their suggestions on how parties who might be in dispute actually could resolve those conflicts. And it's those key concerns that the Select Committee looked at and actually reviewed. So when the bill came back to the House, they considered those particular issues and the mechanism with which those parties potentially in dispute could resolve those disputes. It also, Mr. Speaker, provided the mechanism which may provide compensation for some property owners who will be disadvantaged by any new boundaries that may be drawn. Because at the end of the day, it could be that some boundaries go into areas, perhaps that might be the edges of rivers or creeks, for example, and you cannot, the boundaries are no longer appropriate. So there are opportunities within this bill to provide some remedy for property owners in that regard. And Mr. Speaker, we've had a lot of zoning done to us as Canterbury property owners, so we're really pleased that this bill addresses some key concerns. Some of the concerns will be around property value, of course, but mostly around ensuring that people feel that there is a fair process, that they are going to get a fair deal, and that if they have decided to stay on their properties, that those properties are actually going to be identified and titled appropriately. So without wanting to hold up this bill, we do commend it. It is a good piece of legislation. The Select Committee did work well on addressing those issues of the interim survey and how the remediation could be put in place after the bill is actually enacted, and we do commend it to the House.
Nook Kura.